When the first glass broke, she did not flinch. The sound crossed the ballroom like a small, sharp bird, and every face turned. A waiter froze. A photographer lowered his camera. His hand had hit the table by mistake. That was all. But the word had already left his mouth. Disgrace. The syllables reached her after the glass did. One breath later, cold and clean like winter water. She stood by the cake with the gold sugar roses, and she did not cry. She felt the sting settle in her ribs and then recede, as if grief had learned its manners inside her. It was their anniversary party, the 10th. Chandeliers glowed above 100 strangers, who knew the price of everything and the weight of nothing. He looked taller than he had in the morning, the way men look taller when pride stands on their shoulders. She watched him try to gather the room back with a smile. She could see the smile fail. She could see the word rise from the floor and sit between them like an old judge. She noticed the slow click of the clock hidden behind the columns. Someone had set it wrong, and it ticked 2 minutes ahead. She noticed that detail because details had kept her alive for years. They were the small steps she took when the larger ones shook. They used to live on a street that smelled of fried dough and wet bicycles. His shoes would squeak when he came up the narrow stairwell, and she would laugh at it every time as if she had never heard it before. The building had a thin elevator that trembled like a throat. Their apartment was a rectangle of warm light. The kitchen could fit only one person comfortably, so they took turns pretending to be comfortable. A wind chime hung above the sink, made of shells his mother had collected on a beach 2 cities away. Even in winter, it sang. He returned late most nights, not with money, but with breathless plans. He sketched them on the back of utility bills, a graph climbing a mountain, a line stepping over a chasm, numbers that looked like rescued birds on paper. She brewed cheap coffee that smelled like courage when the door was closed and fear when it was open. She was a seamstress then, fingers always carrying the memory of thread. He called himself a founder before anyone agreed. The city coughed sirens each night, but in their rooms there was a hush like snow that had decided to wait. They married on a Tuesday, because the hall was half price. Rain stitched the afternoon into a quiet fabric, and they kept it. His mother wore a blue dress that had been her sister's and dabbed her eyes with a napkin that left lint on her cheeks. Her father, who used to fix radios and now fixed silence, placed a hand on her shoulder before the ceremony and kept it there long enough to say everything he could not. When they exchanged rings, the lights flickered, and everyone laughed because they were young and believed the world flickered for them. They ate lemon cake and danced awkwardly. She pressed her face against his shirt and smelled the detergent they had measured too generously. It smelled like beginnings. He started the company in a room above a grocery that sold flowers too early each morning. The petals seemed sleepy when she walked past. He hired 3 people who were not sure whether they had been hired or had just decided to work there. He borrowed a friend's desk that had one short leg, and they propped it with a folded newspaper. He talked to suppliers who paused the phone to argue with their children in the background. She learned how to read a term sheet by tracing each letter with her finger silently, as if it might cut her. They survived the first year by teaching every bill to wait. When the second year arrived, the bills returned with cousins. They lost money and then found it like spare change under a seat. He built his first deal the way a child builds a kite, not knowing which string matters until the wind proves it. They made mistakes that did not kill them and learned to bow to the ones that almost did. There were days she would put a stitch through fabric and imagine it was a stitch through time, holding a future to a present so it could not fall. His mother sent voice notes full of recipes and warnings about cold air. Her father mailed old clippings from magazines, corners turned down, circles around articles about perseverance and oils for sore hands. The city grew taller around them, and their rooms learned new shadows. When success finally came, it did not arrive like a parade. It came the way a snowfall begins, one flake, then another, and then the sudden certainty that the ground has changed. He introduced her to people whose watches cost more than their smiles. Consultants explained things to them that they had learned the hard way. He learned to keep a jacket on a chair even when he was not cold. She learned the names of people who would never learn hers. Their elevator became wider, their windows glassier, their evenings shorter, their mornings a negotiation with light. The first driver they hired wore gloves even in June. The first assistant wrote every word she spoke in a small notebook and looked up only to swallow. Reporters called. Photographers asked them to move their heads half an inch to the left. He told the story everyone expected about grit and destiny and the way his eyes had always known the horizon. He did not always remember to mention her, but when he did, he held her hand with the same pressure he used on a pen when signing a deal. That pressure meant "I know," even if he forgot to say it. Wealth is a language that changes the meaning of silence. People started laughing before he finished a joke. Invitations arrived from rooms where air learns to hold its breath. Their anniversary parties grew taller than memory. The flowers came in trucks. The tables reflected light like a lake. She watched him become a man with doors held open that had once been closed. She watched him enjoy it, then rely on it. Power has a way of recalculating what is right. It calls a shortcut a vision. It calls impatience a standard. He hired men who spoke in numbers and women who spoke in assurances. Her world had always been made of hands and time. Theirs was made of speed. At first, she tried to keep the quiet they had shared. She asked about his day, when his day had already asked for everything. She packed small lunches like offerings to a god of schedules. She kept the wind chime in a larger kitchen, though the windows were too perfect to allow a breeze. She made tea for his mother when she visited, and warmed a blanket as if warmth could keep time from wandering. She walked the same city streets they had once walked together, now watched by cameras that forgot to blink. She shook hands with wives whose rings arrived like statements before their words could. She invented reasons to spend days in the old neighborhood, where flower petals still looked sleepy at dawn, and voices still carried across stairwells, like clotheslines. He was not cruel then, only busy. Busy can bend into careless without anyone noticing the angle. His compliments shortened into nods. His questions became updates spoken in a tone that made words efficient. She felt the first small break the day he asked someone else to choose her dress for a public event. She smiled and wore the dress. The second break came when a lawyer suggested she sign a document to streamline the estate. He told her it was a formality, and perhaps it was, but formality is the polite face of a shift. She signed, and the pen left a small dent on her finger where her ring rubbed against it. She rubbed the dent for days. The people around him began to treat her as if she were a museum piece. Beautiful if left untouched. A stylist adjusted a strand of hair and then apologized as if an accident had occurred. A journalist asked her what it felt like to be the heart of a brand, and she wondered when a heart had been hired. The assistant who wrote in a small notebook learned to walk at his pace and to frown first, so he would not have to. His mother noticed. Mothers notice the air more than the furniture. She took the older woman's hand once in a greenhouse full of plants that had never known a wild wind and felt that hand hold back. Grief like a gate that creaks but remains closed. Rumors came, because rumors arrive where light is expensive. The internet found pictures where none existed and context where none was needed. She learned to let strangers instruct her about her life from their couches. She learned to place her phone face down without placing her heart face down with it. He dismissed it all with the wave of a person who had learned to wave away entire storms. She pretended the storms had not dampened her clothes. On the morning of their 10th anniversary, she arranged a gift in a box without ribbon. She chose the box from a small shop near the river where the owner kept handwritten labels for each season. The label read Winter Light, though it was autumn. She placed inside the box 8 letters and 1 key. She tied the box with a piece of string from her sewing kit, not as an aesthetic, but as a memory of an old way of keeping things together. She placed the box under the bed where dust still gathered because wealth cannot tidy everything. She dressed in a silver dress because he liked silver on her, or he used to. She wore shoes that would let her stand for hours without groaning, because dignity can include comfortable soles. The party was a study in arrangements. Lights arranged to flatter, tables arranged to signal, people arranged to be seen. The cake rose like a palace where no one would live. A video played on loop of their first days, cut down to the pieces that looked most like a myth. He moved through the room as if he had been born in it. He was greeted by men who measured time in quarters and women who measured it in seasons. She saw the assistant gesture to a cluster of guests with a subtle tilt of her chin. She saw cameras wait for laughter the way dogs wait for a throw. She had grown good at being still. It made her seem poised. It kept her joined. When the mistake with the glass happened, it was only that a glass, a hand, gravity until it was not. He turned in a way that made his shoulder sharper. Something in him had been straining for weeks, and sometimes a small tear lets all the waiting pain through. The word came out the way an old truth leaves a mouth when it is tired of pretending to be a joke. Disgrace. His eyes flickered the moment after, as if a fuse had blown in a mansion that never loses power. She felt the room lean toward the word, like plants toward light. There were people who pretended not to hear. There were people who heard and wore pity on their faces like borrowed scarves. His mother closed her eyes for 3 slow counts and then opened them to a different world. A musician stepped back from the microphone and looked at the floor. The assistants began to repair the night because that was their task. She stood for one breath, then another, and found a place inside those breaths where she could live for the next 10 minutes. She felt the wind chime of her old kitchen inside her chest and listened to it. She walked to him with the carefulness one brings to a ledge. Her hand did not shake as she took the box from the small bag. She placed the box on the table between them without ceremony. He did not reach for it right away. Pride rarely opens gifts. When at last his fingers pulled the string, the room became a church without the permission of belief. He lifted the first letter. The paper had been folded by hands that do not handle paper often. His mother recognized the handwriting before he did, because she remembered the woman who wrote it. It was hers. He unfolded his mother's voice. In the letter, the older woman had written about a day when he was 8. When they had walked by a bakery and he had offered his 1 coin to a stranger who could not afford bread. She had kept the letter in a drawer for years, adding to it with a different pen each time she remembered a day when his heart had been wider than his hunger. He read about a coat he had shared on a bus in January with a man who smelled like the street, and how he had not told anyone about it because he believed kindness is quieter when it is true. He found the second letter. It was from a nurse at a clinic near their old neighborhood. The nurse wrote about a donation that had arrived 2 years earlier under his name, funding a small room for mothers to rest while their babies slept. The donation had not come from him. It had come from her, using money he had given her long ago for whatever you want to do with yourself. Words he had thrown into the air as if they meant nothing. Words she had held the way one holds water in 2 careful hands. The nurse described a mother who had returned a month after a surgery just to sit in that room with a cup of tea and her toes uncurled, and how she had whispered "thank you" to no one. The nurse had traced the donation back and found her number and called and then sent this letter at her request because she believed a gift should be returned to the person who inspired it, even if he had not given the money. He read the third letter. It was from one of the first employees who had left during a brutal winter when salaries were late. The letter explained that a small envelope had appeared on his doorstep that January with enough to keep his family fed until the company rescued itself. It had contained no note, just an old sticker from a laundromat near their first office. He had known then. He had chosen to leave anyway. Years later, when his wife was pregnant again, an arrangement arrived for her medical bills with the hospital, no names attached. He thanked her now, though he knew she would never cash the check he finally could send. Instead, he asked her to let the gratitude land where it belonged, on the man she had shielded with her quiet choices, so that he could grow into the man he had wanted to be. The fourth letter was from a teacher, who wrote of scholarships in his name at the local school. Children who had never seen their names printed on anything had seen them on acceptance letters. The fifth letter was from a woman who had been turned away by one of his companies after a sick leave. Her story had found its way to her, and she had intervened privately, and the woman had kept her job and her dignity. The letter did not ask for anything. It just told the truth the way the poor tell truth when they are tired, plainly, with no adjectives. Like a clean window, the sixth and the seventh letters were from vendors who had been paid early during a pandemic, because someone had found their invoices and called their numbers and said, "We can help now." Those vendors had stayed open long enough to repay a different kindness to someone else. The letters carried the weight of those chains of mercy, the way quilts carry the weight of all the rooms they have warmed. The eighth letter was from his mother again, written last week, telling him that she had been part of arranging these letters to come to him. Through her, because he did not always listen when he should, and because she knew that sons sometimes need their mothers to hold up a mirror that shows them when their faces have become strangers to their hearts. He reached the key. It lay on the bottom like a punctuation mark. It was the key to their first apartment. She had asked the new tenants if she could have it, and they had given it to her because they understood what a talisman does for a person who needs a compass. The metal was worn smooth by years of pockets that had long since changed pants. He placed it in his palm and felt the cold decide he was real. No one spoke. The assistants stopped assisting. The waiters waited. His mother held the arms of her chair. The clock behind the column ticked 2 minutes fast, insisting that the future was here. He looked up at her. She did not lower her eyes. Her spine had learned a new line sometime in the last year, a line that held her up even when the world leaned. He saw then that she had been living with a quiet he had not noticed. Not an empty quiet, a full one, with rooms in it. He realized that she had allowed him to think he had built everything alone so that he would not feel like a guest in his own success. Realization is a soft knife when it arrives this late. He wanted to apologize. But there are apologies that crumble when they try to leave a mouth because the deeds behind them have not been built yet. She watched him choose silence over a weak word, and for the first time in months, respect returned to her face like the tide returning to shape the shore. She lifted her hand and rested it on the table near the box. Her ring flashed, not with wealth, but with memory. She did not take his hand. She did not move away. She simply stood there long enough for the letters to settle in the air. He left the party early. The guests stumbled into goodbyes that looked like exits from a play. She rode home in the back of a car that knew her address better than some of her friends did. She took off the silver dress and folded it the way you fold a season when it ends. She placed the empty box on the dresser and watched it as if it might learn to speak. She made tea because grief and love both ask for warmth. She sat with the steam rising like a small ghost of comfort and thought about the gift she had not included, the envelope in the desk drawer with papers that would let him go. She had not decided yet. She had carried those papers for months, the way a person carries a candle through a house at night, when the lights have failed and every corner might hold a chair to bump into. She did not hate him. Hate is a busy thing. She did not have the time. She had many kinds of love for him, and some of them had become illnesses. She needed to learn which kinds could become medicine again. She slept in a bed that felt larger than truth. The next morning, he came home before the sun concluded its negotiations with the blinds. He moved through the kitchen with a carefulness that suggested a human had learned how to walk among breakable things. He did not touch her shoulder. He poured water. He opened and closed drawers as if they might wake a child. He stood by the window and watched a bird consider a ledge and then abandon it. He put his phone face down and left it there, a small act of humility in a life that had not required many. He spent the day in rooms that had never needed him to be impressive. He listened to the old wind chime in his mind. He read the letters again, then again. He walked into his office and asked a man who had been paid to be certain to be quiet for a while. He called his mother. He called no one else. She went to the clinic. The nurse who had written the letter looked at her with the surprise that appears when a private kindness learns it has been seen. She walked through the small room for mothers and touched the table as if blessing would. She sat on a chair that had held hundreds of women who needed exactly this kind of pause. She cried a little in the way a person cries when the body insists on integrity. Tears left and then arrived again. Like commuters, he visited the old neighborhood without an entourage, an act that felt rebellious in a way that embarrassed him. He stood outside the grocery where the flowers still woke too early. He pressed the old key against his palm and then slid it in a pocket with the tenderness we reserve for dangerous small things, like pills or promises. He waited for a feeling to rise. When it did, it was not nostalgia. It was a stern tenderness for his past self, the boy who had believed he could afford sincerity. He walked past the laundromat with the old stickers. He stood outside the building that had taught him which stairs creak. He thought of a night when a deal had fallen apart and he had laughed because, too, much fear had made laughter the only response the body could organize. He remembered that she had made soup that evening with too much salt and how they had eaten it anyway because love makes mistakes taste like rituals. Change did not arrive like a miracle. He was not a story that finishes a chapter and wakes up someone else. He did what a grown man can do when he sees that he has failed the best witness to his life. He stopped letting other people decide what was important. He softened his edges around the people who had never been impressed by them. He let people who had been loyal speak in full sentences. He corrected those who corrected her. He began to notice how his name moved in rooms when he wasn't there, and he followed it with acts that felt like reclamation. He spent money without letting it lead. He wrote checks to places that served people who would never know his signature had crossed a line for them. He asked questions that could not be answered with numbers. She watched, not as a judge, but as someone who had to live in the house that change would build or abandon. Some days his correction looked like performance. Some days it looked like work. She knew the difference. She waited without pretending to wait forever. She learned new skills because her hands still wanted to be useful in ways that were not about rescuing a man. She took a course on nonprofit management and sat in the back like a girl trying not to attract attention. Though attention often finds the humble because it is hungry for its own redemption, she started a foundation that funded clinics like the one whose letter had found him. She did it under a name that was neither his nor hers, a name that belonged to the kind of quiet she respected. She met women who taught her that dignity is a currency that cannot be devalued by anyone but the owner. One evening, months after the party, they stood on the balcony as dusk negotiated with the city. The wind found a way into their high life and moved a plant as if it were back in a ground where it knew. The names of the other plants, he took the key from his pocket and placed it on the table between them. He did not ask. She did not offer. They looked at it as if it were a small animal that might scare if addressed. He told her with his hands, with his attention. With the new habit of waiting for a person to finish a thought that he had been to the old street, she knew she had seen a smudge of grime on his shoe weeks before and had understood what it meant. She had chosen not to mention it because some pilgrimages must be allowed. Their secret route, she brought the envelope from the drawer. She placed it next to the key. The papers inside were ready to free him, ready to free her, ready to free whatever had been held hostage by wealth's performance. He looked at the envelope as if it were a map. She looked at it as if it were a mirror. Freedom can look like abandonment to the one left, and like mercy to the one who leaves. The decision would define the shapes of their mornings. He did not touch the envelope. He did not look away from it either. He asked her, without words, what gift she had intended to give him that night at the party beyond the letters and the key. She answered, without words, that she had wanted to give him back his first self. The one who had offered a coin to a stranger's hunger without needing a camera. The one who had worn a too big coat that still warmed someone else. The one who had loved her without delegating it. The one who had believed that a wind chime was enough to make a kitchen a sanctuary. She told him, again without words, that she could not keep living beside a performance that asked her to disappear each time it wanted to applause. He told her, with the same grammar of looks, that he did not want a life whose furniture was arranged around his ego. They stood until the city pulled its lights up like a blanket. She slid the envelope back toward herself and placed it on the other side of the table. Not yet, her hand said. Maybe never, but not yet. He nodded, the way a man nods when he has learned that consent is a kind of love more erotic than any conquest. The next day, he went to his office and changed the policy that had been hurting people who lacked the voice to argue. He sent messages to those who had left because of him and did not insist they return. He returned bonuses he should not have accepted. He stood in front of a board and told the truth about a mistake without blaming weather or competition. He watched them react as if their feet had turned to stone. He recognized the feeling. Stone feet cannot run toward virtue nor away from shame. He learned to move anyway. On the anniversary of the party, he canceled the ballroom. They made dinner at home. He burned the fish, and they ate it laughing, because growth makes room for imperfection again. His mother fell asleep on the couch with a blanket over her knees. They walked around the block, and then around it again because the air was gentle, and the city felt like it belonged to them for 1 hour. He held her hand in a way that meant more listening than holding. They passed a couple arguing, and did not judge them because they understood how two people can stand in the same breeze and feel different winters. She continued the foundation. She kept her own key to her own office, a small thing that felt like lungs working after a long underwater swim. She traveled to clinics where the floors had been mopped with devotion. She met babies who reached for her necklace and mothers who reached for her eyes. She did not post pictures because not every good thing needs an audience to become true. She sent him occasional letters the way a lighthouse sends light, regular.com, unconcerned with whether the ship will use it. He sent her notes in the margins of documents she cared about, where questions sharpened her plans rather than sliced them. One afternoon, he found a note from the old employee who had left in winter. The man had used the scholarship his child received to learn coding and now worked at a company he admired. He had named his new dog after the street where they had started their first office. It was a silly detail that wrapped itself around his heart and pulled. He forwarded the note to her. She smiled in a room where no one could see, and then walked outside to feel air. The wind moved in a way that sounded like possibility when it rubs against brick. 2 years after the party, they stood in front of a building with a sign that did not carry his surname. It carried something older, something that had the texture of a blessing before you learn who blessed it. It was a community clinic with a waiting room that felt like a living room. It would outlast their marriage if it had to. It would outlast their marriage even if it did not have to. That was the point. Love that is not trapped inside two people has a chance to remain honest. They walked through the rooms and paused where the walls held the sun in a way that made winter look less certain. At the opening, there were no cameras, only phones held by mothers to capture their toddlers, pointing at the fish in a small tank, mouths shaped like tiny O's of wonder. He spoke briefly to a nurse about supply chains, because that was how his brain still showed love, practical and precise. She spoke to a teenager about pain that hides in the stomach, because it has been told not to show on the face. They met in the hallway and paused like people do when they realize they are walking at the same pace without intending to. They looked at a bulletin board covered in job postings and notices for free classes. A paper fluttered where a thumbtack had loosened, and he reached to fix it. She watched his fingers steady the paper and thought about all the things hands can choose to do. That night, she placed the envelope on the table again. They had lived across from their decision long enough to know it had become something else. It was no longer a knife. It was a door. Doors do not threaten. They invite. She opened the envelope and removed the papers. She took out a pen. She did not sign. Instead, she wrote a note on the first page. The note said that love is not proven by how long it suffers. It is proven by what it produces when suffering arrives, either cruelty or courage. She had seen both in their home. In the last 2 years, the courage had been getting taller. She returned the papers to the envelope and placed it back in the drawer where old Season slept. She did not tell him. Not telling was not a game. It was a way of giving trust room to breathe without being ordered to. He understood anyway, like a person who wakes in the night and knows which door leads to water in the dark. On their 12th anniversary, he brought her a different box. It came without ribbon, with only a small note. Inside was the wind chime from their first kitchen. Repaired, he had found the shells in a drawer at his mother's house, strings knotted and lines cut. He had restrung it himself, clumsy and patient. And now it chimed when the window opened and a city-bought wind remembered how to enter a home instead of a penthouse. He held the chime up and the sound moved like forgiveness, doing its quiet work. She closed her eyes and counted not to 3 but to nothing, because counting had been a way to survive. She did not need it for this. They did not become perfect people. Perfection is a trick camera. They argued about small things and then learned to argue about the real ones. He still failed sometimes in the ways men fail when they have been taught. By the world that they are the center and must teach themselves that they are not. She still retreated sometimes into the cape of competence that had saved her and now threatened to keep her cold. They learned to name these habits without keeping them. The naming became a practice, like prayer or stretching. A way to keep the joints movable. He stopped calling other people to fix the things he had broken with his mouth. He taught his tongue to pause, not because pausing is fashionable, but because it is moral. He laughed again the way he had laughed when they were poor, and a bill had come with a 0 that looked like a moon. She began to rest at noon some days, not because she was tired, but because rest is not a prize. It is an ingredient. She let a dress choose her sometimes. She let her hair be a little imperfect on a camera day. That small rebellion fed her, and about the gift. The one she had intended to give him the night he called her what she was not. She ended up giving it anyway, not as a scene, but as a season. She gave him back the first boy. She gave him back his mother's faith, repackaged as his own. She gave him back a marriage that did not need a ballroom to prove itself. She gave him freedom, not from her, but from the performance that had turned him into an actor in an expensive play. About a man who wins and loses, the one witness who knows whether he is still himself. She gave him a way out of that theater. He followed the exit signs she lit with the quiet he had once loved and had forgotten to love. He would still sometimes wake and feel the ghost of that word pressed against his mouth. Disgrace, it would remind him of a night where his worst self tried to take the microphone. He would place his hand on his chest and listened to the wind chime across the room. The shells would pull a sound from the air that told him the audience had left. The stage had been broken down, the lights had been returned to the sky where they belong. And when she walked through the clinic halls, older now, hair gathered at the nape, the way one gathers a story too big to be told in one sitting, the mothers would still lift their eyes and feel seen. She would pause by the fish tank where toddlers learned the open shape of wonder. She would watch the small hands press against glass and then slide away, leaving prints that someone else would clean. The prints would say, "We were here. For a moment, we were here." She would go home to the chime, and the man who had learned how to hold apology long enough for it to become architecture and not just an echo. When the city was honest enough to be quiet, she would open the drawer and hold the envelope. She would not read the papers. She would not tear them. She kept them not as a threat, but as a reminder that freedom had always been within reach, even when love forgot. The key lay beside it, wearing its age beautifully. She would close the drawer and return to the balcony where he stood, looking at a sky that finally belonged to no one and everyone. She would lean her head against his shoulder and feel the weight of years settle into a shape that fit them both. He never used the word again. It had burned its way out of his vocabulary the way a field burns clean and then grows truer. What he said now was smaller. Thank you in the morning over bitter coffee. Here in the afternoon, when schedules tried to steal him, I see in the evening when the city pretended it was the only light left, she never asked him to promise forever. Forever is a boast. She asked him to notice. Noticing is a vow that renews itself with each looked-at face, each listened to fear, each chosen pause. They grew old in a house where the expensive things learned humility. The sofas invited naps from people in jeans. The china held simple soup. The walls wore pictures of small moments, a shoe smudge on a white floor that had demanded care, a hand mending the hem of a dress that cost too much to be this fragile, a laugh that survived a long winter. The clinic multiplied. Their names did not travel with it. Her father's radios, now silent, sat on a shelf in the hallway, like retired soldiers who had finally found peace. On their 20th anniversary, there was no party. There was a small cake with poor icing and a taste that made them grin at each other with their mouths full. He brought her a copy of the first letter, the one his mother wrote about the bakery coin. He had framed it in a way that made the paper look less fragile and more honest. He hung it near the door. Guests would see it when they left, the way you place wisdom where departure requires guidance. He touched the frame each morning as he went out into a world still greedy for the kind of man he had almost become. He returned most nights with his pockets empty of praise, which is how he preferred it. He never saw the box again from the night of the party. She did not keep empty boxes. Things that had done their work were allowed to become air. But sometimes, late, when the wind moved through the room and the chime answered, he thought he could hear paper unfold again. He imagined his mother's handwriting turning corners on a page with the stern love of a woman who knew what it costs to raise a son into a good man. He imagined his wife's hands tying a string. He felt the key on his palm without lifting his hand. He said thank you to no one, and to the right one, all at once. He had called her a disgrace once. He carried that history like a scar that no longer hurt but taught the skin to respect edges. She had given him the one gift no one had offered him since the first room above the grocery. It was not money, not public absolution, not the theatrics of shame. It was a mirror that did not flatter and would not lie. It was a door that did not lock. It was the key to a small apartment made of wind and laughter where the floor squeaked in the right places. It was the permission to be the boy again, upgraded by honesty. It was the chance to be decent when no one was watching, and to measure himself not by what the world returned, but by who he became in rooms without applause. Sometimes the chime was still. Those were the days when the air was heavy with heat and effort. On those days, they did their work anyway. He held doors for strangers as if he was not in a hurry. She folded blankets in the clinic as if she would be the one to use them later. They sat on a bench and watched a child chase pigeons until the birds decided to forgive. They walked home through streets that belonged to their past as much as their present. The exact lines of the city, less important than the way their steps, had learned to listen. He never saw her again as she had been that night by the cake, unflinching and alone. She never saw him again as he had been taller with pride. They carried those versions of themselves inside as warnings and as proof. When the wind moved through their home, sometimes it brought other sounds to the distant rumble of a street they no longer had to climb. The quiet clack of a key in a lock they kept for the way it felt to open. Sometimes it brought nothing at all, and the nothing was rich enough if he forgot. The letters waited in a drawer at his mother's house and in a frame by the door. If she forgot, the clinic waited with a crying baby and a nurse who knew the difference between a bruise and a shadow. And if both of them forgot at the same time, the wind knew their names. It came even when windows were designed to keep it out, and it told the shells to sing. The song was not always pretty. It was always true. It said that love, when it stays, does not stay because it never broke. It stays because it learned how to become a bridge when a gap opened that looked impossible. And sometimes, late after the city side, and the last light turned off, somewhere important, the house listened to its own heartbeat and whispered the gift again, not as a memory or a secret, but as a way to live.